James had always dreamed of visiting London. After months of planning, he finally found himself standing in the heart of the city, staring at the impressive Buckingham Palace. It was a cloudy day, but the excitement in the air was enough to lift his spirits. His friends, equally thrilled, were snapping pictures, eager to capture every moment. It was a famous spot, the perfect place for tourists to come and see the world-renowned royal guard. Those perfectly still soldiers in their bright red uniforms and tall black hats, standing guard at the palace. James had seen pictures of them before, but seeing them in person was a whole different experience. The guards, mounted on magnificent horses, looked like something out of a history book. Everything about them screamed discipline and tradition. The crowd around them was huge, with people from all over the world gathered to witness the spectacle. James, however, wasn't like the other tourists. While most people were respectful and quietly admired the guards, James had a mischievous side. He was known for pushing the limits, making jokes, and doing things that others wouldn't dare to do. He wanted to have fun on this trip, and to him, that meant breaking the rules a little, just for the thrill of it. As he watched the guards, an idea popped into his head. What would happen if I did something to get their attention? He thought. He could tell that everyone around was watching the guards, mesmerized by their stillness. James felt a rush of excitement. Why not make this moment unforgettable? Ignoring the concerned looks from his friends, who had already started to move away from him, James stepped a little closer to the guards. He felt bold. After all, he was just a tourist in a foreign country. The rules didn't seem as important when he was in the mood to have fun. The guards didn't react to him. They stood there, as still as statues, their eyes forward, completely focused on their task. But James wasn't discouraged. He could tell that they were waiting for someone to test their patience. He began to mock the guards, making silly faces and exaggerated movements behind them. The crowd chuckled, but most of them ignored him. Then he took it a step further. As the guards' horses stood perfectly still, James got a mischievous glint in his eye. He was determined to see how much he could push them. A few tourists nearby started whispering to each other, shaking their heads. They could sense that James was about to do something that would cross the line, but James didn't care. He thought it was all just part of the fun. Little did he know, this was about to be a decision he'd regret. James couldn't stop grinning. The guards were still standing there, as silent and unmoving as statues. To him, this just wasn't exciting enough. He needed something more. He wanted to see if he could get a reaction out of them. I bet they're just pretending to be statues, he thought to himself. I'll show everyone how serious I am about having fun on this trip. He was aware of the tourists watching him, some smiling and some looking uneasy, but that only made it more thrilling for James. He didn't mind the attention. In fact, he liked it. The bigger the audience, the better the show he could put on. He eyed the horses again, admiring how strong and majestic they were. The horses were just as still as the guards, their heads held high, their coats shining in the dim light. But James didn't see these horses the same way everyone else did. To him, they were just another part of the show. He could tell that the horses weren't going to move unless something serious happened, and that's exactly what he was hoping for. At first, James just started shouting at the horses. He waved his arms in front of their faces, hoping to see one of them twitch or look at him. The horses didn't budge. They just stood there, calm and collected, their eyes fixed ahead. James thought it was hilarious. He started mocking the horses now, making funny noises and faces, trying to get a reaction. But the horses didn't react. The guards didn't react either. They remained as calm as ever. James, however, wasn't about to give up. If anything, their lack of response just made him want to try harder. Then, a dangerous thought crossed his mind. What if I did something that would really get their attention? He wondered. James was starting to get carried away, not fully aware of how far he was pushing things. He didn't realize how disrespectful his actions were to the guards and the crowd. The longer he stared at the horses, the more determined he became. He noticed that one of the horses was a large black stallion, standing proudly with its glossy coat. It looked strong, powerful, and untouchable. James thought to himself, maybe if I do something bold, something they never expect, I'll finally get a reaction. Without thinking about the consequences, he reached down, grabbed a small rock from the ground, and hurled it toward the horse. The stone wasn't big, but it was enough to cause a slight disturbance. The horse jerked its head, startled by the sudden impact, but it didn't run or panic. It simply shifted its weight, making a soft noise. The guard on the horse turned sharply, glaring at James. James froze for a second. He realized what he had just done. He had crossed the line. The crowd around them went quiet. Some people gasped, while others just stared in shock. James could feel the eyes of the other tourists on him. But now it wasn't fun anymore. The thrill of getting attention quickly faded, replaced by the sinking feeling that maybe he had done something he shouldn't have. As the guard stared him down, James realized his mistake, but it was too late to take it back now. He had gotten the reaction he wanted, but it wasn't the kind of attention he had hoped for. James stood there for a moment, frozen in shock. The stone he had thrown had barely touched the horse, but it was enough to get a reaction. The horse had shifted its body, its head turning toward the source of the disturbance. The guard on the horse quickly turned his gaze as well, his eyes narrowing as he locked onto James. For a brief second, James thought maybe the guard would simply ignore him. Maybe everything would go back to normal. But as soon as their eyes met, James knew that was not going to happen. The guard didn't look amused at all. In fact, the expression on his face made it clear that this was not a game. James had just crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. The surrounding crowd grew silent, with many people staring in disbelief. A few even began whispering to each other, some pointing at James with their phones, quietly recording the moment. James could feel his face turning red, a mix of embarrassment and fear creeping up on him. He had expected the situation to be funny, but now he realized it was quickly turning into something much more serious. The guard on the horse, his posture stiff and commanding, called out firmly, his voice carrying across the area. "Step back immediately." The words were sharp, and there was no room for argument. The tone in his voice made it clear that James had done something wrong. The horse, though calm for now, was clearly agitated, and it was obvious that the guard was not going to let the matter slide. James hesitated, not sure how to respond. For a moment, he thought about brushing it off as a harmless joke, but then he noticed the two police officers nearby, who had already started walking in his direction, alerted by the disturbance. James knew that at this point, there was no way out. His joke had turned into a serious mistake. The crowd, which had been quiet up until now, began to murmur. Some people were shaking their heads in disapproval, while others were whispering things like, "What was he thinking?" And "That's disrespectful." James could feel the eyes of everyone around him, all focused on his moment of shame. The situation was getting worse by the second. The officers reached James and the guard, and without wasting any time, one of them spoke up. "We need you to come with us. You've just caused a disturbance with the Royal Guard's horse, and that's not something to joke about." James tried to explain himself, but his words stumbled out. I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a prank." He stammered, realizing how weak his defense sounded. But the officers weren't buying it. They weren't there to entertain his excuses. Their job was to maintain order, and James had disrupted that order in a big way. The guard, still on his horse, kept his eyes on James. The tension in the air was thick. The officer motioned for James to step aside, and he reluctantly obeyed, his heart pounding in his chest. The fun he had expected to get from the day was quickly fading, replaced by a growing sense of regret. As James was escorted away from the scene, he could hear the crowd behind him, some still watching, others already turning back to enjoy the rest of the day. The reality of what he had just done was starting to sink in, and he couldn't help but feel foolish. This wasn't the fun trip he had imagined. It had turned into a public embarrassment, one that he would never forget. James walked with the police officers, his steps slow and heavy. He felt like everyone was staring at him, and he couldn't escape the feeling of embarrassment. The officers led him away from the area where the royal guard stood, their eyes fixed on him, as if they were keeping a close watch on what he would do next. The crowd, which had been so lively and excited just moments ago, was now quiet. People whispered among themselves, some still shaking their heads in disbelief. As they reached the nearby police station, James could feel the weight of his actions bearing down on him. He tried to tell himself that it wasn't a big deal, that it was just a little joke, something harmless. But deep down, he knew he had made a serious mistake. The thought of what could happen next made his stomach twist. He had thrown a rock at the horse, and in doing so, he had crossed a line he couldn't easily erase. Inside the station, the officers spoke to James sternly. They explained the seriousness of his actions and how he had disrupted a tradition that had been respected for centuries. "You can't just mess with the royal guard like that," one officer said. "Those horses and guards are an important part of our country's history. You can't treat them like a joke." James felt guilty, but he didn't know how to fix what he had done. He hadn't thought it through before acting. He hadn't understood the gravity of the situation, but now it was all too clear. His actions had caused trouble, not just for him, but for the royal guard and the entire group of tourists who had been there to see the ceremony. What should have been a peaceful and exciting moment had now turned into a spectacle for all the wrong reasons. After a few minutes, one of the officers sat down with James. "You've caused a disturbance, and there will be consequences for this," the officer said. "We need to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that people understand the seriousness of messing with the royal guard." James tried to explain that he hadn't meant any harm, that it was all a mistake. "I just thought it would be funny," he said, his voice quiet and filled with regret. "I never meant to upset anyone." But the officer didn't seem moved by his explanation. "It's not about what you meant. It's about what you did," the officer replied. "And you'll need to take responsibility for it." James sat there, feeling more and more like a fool with each passing second. He had no idea how his little prank had turned into something so serious. What had started as a moment of fun had spiraled out of control, and now he had to face the consequences. He thought about his friends who had walked away from him earlier. They hadn't been involved in what had happened, but now they would be dragged into his mistake. He could only imagine how embarrassed they must be, knowing that they had been with him when it all went down. As the police officers finished up the paperwork, James realized that this trip to London would be one he would never forget. It wouldn't be remembered for the sightseeing or the fun times with his friends. Instead, it would always be remembered as the day he made a foolish decision that led to serious consequences. James had never felt so ashamed in his life. The officers had made it clear that his behavior would not go unpunished, but it wasn't just the police that were making him feel like this. The real consequence had already begun, the public backlash. As he sat in the small room at the police station, he could hear voices from the outside. People were talking about him, whispers mixed with shocked expressions. He had no idea that his little stunt would cause such an uproar. But now it was clear that he had made a big mistake. The moment he had thrown the rock, he hadn't realized how serious the situation was. To him, it had felt like a harmless prank, but to everyone else, it was a sign of disrespect. The Royal Guard was one of the most iconic symbols of British tradition, and to disturb them was seen as an attack on something sacred. James had acted without thinking, and now he was facing the consequences. The officers didn't waste any time. They had already started filling out reports about the incident, and it wasn't long before the news began to spread. A few tourists who had witnessed what happened had already begun to share the story. The video of James mocking the guards and throwing the rock at the horse was being shared across social media platforms, and soon it was everywhere. James could hear his name being spoken by strangers as if it was a curse. Some people online were calling him a fool, while others were much harsher. His actions had not only embarrassed himself, but had caused a public disturbance, and people weren't going to let him forget it anytime soon. James' phone buzzed on the table, and he knew it was probably a notification from social media. He hesitated before picking it up. He already had a bad feeling about what he was going to see. Sure enough, as soon as he unlocked his phone, he was greeted by dozens of messages and posts. Most of them were comments mocking him, calling him names like the tourist who disrespected the Queen's Guard. Others were less kind, saying things like, "That's what happens when you mess with tradition," and "He'll never live this down." He couldn't help but feel the sting of those words. He'd made a joke, but now it was something much worse. His actions had caused trouble, not just for himself, but for the reputation of other tourists as well. He had become the example of what not to do when visiting London, and he couldn't escape it. James tried to make it right by posting an apology on his own social media, explaining that it had been a mistake. But as soon as he posted it, the response was even worse. People didn't believe him. They accused him of only apologizing because he'd gotten caught. Some even laughed at his attempt to fix things. "Too little, too late," someone commented. "You should have thought before throwing that rock." His friends, who had been with him at the scene, were already distancing themselves. They didn't want to be involved in the mess James had created. They had known him for years, but this stunt had crossed the line. James sank into the chair, his face flushed with embarrassment. The reality of his actions was finally hitting him. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was something that would follow him forever. As the hours passed, James sat in the station, waiting to hear what would happen next. The crowd outside had mostly dispersed, but the consequences of his actions were still very much alive on social media, and he knew it would take a long time to shake off the shame he felt now. James sat nervously in the small room at the police station, his hands clenched together in his lap. He had spent the last few hours thinking about the mistake he made and how it was going to affect his future. The officers had told him he would face legal consequences, but what exactly that meant was still unclear. All he knew was that it wasn't going to be good. The room felt cold, and James' heart raced as he waited. His mind kept going over the events of the day, how he'd mocked the royal guard, how he had thrown the rock at the horse, and how everything had escalated so quickly. Now, it wasn't just about his actions anymore. It was about the legal ramifications of what he had done. The officer who had been talking to him earlier returned. He looked serious, and James could tell this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "James," the officer began, his voice firm but not unkind, "you've caused a disturbance today. What you did wasn't just a prank. It was an act of disrespect, and it won't be taken lightly." James felt his stomach drop. He knew he had messed up, but hearing the officer speak about it in such serious terms made him realize the full weight of his actions. The officer continued, "You've thrown a rock at the horse, which could have caused it to become startled. The horse could have hurt itself, or even worse, the guard could have been injured. This kind of behavior could result in a fine or even more serious legal action." The word fine caught James' attention. He had heard about people being fined for things like littering or speeding, but he had never imagined he would be facing such a thing himself. He tried to think back to all the times he'd taken chances, making jokes and causing a scene, but this was something else. This was real. "I never meant for anything bad to happen," James said, his voice quieter than before. "I just thought it would be funny. I didn't think anyone would get hurt." The officer looked at him for a moment before responding. "Intentions don't change the fact that what you did was wrong. You've broken the law, and now we have to deal with the consequences." James nodded, feeling the weight of the words. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he had a feeling that this was just the beginning. His friends had already distanced themselves from him, and the public outrage was still fresh in his mind. But now, it seemed like the legal consequences were going to be even worse than he imagined. The officer handed James a piece of paper that outlined the possible consequences. It wasn't just about the fine. There were other penalties, too. Things like being banned from certain areas or facing charges for causing a disturbance. The more he read, the more his mind raced. He never imagined that a simple prank could lead to so much trouble. "I'll have to leave the country early," James thought to himself. "I can't stay here with all this hanging over my head." The officer gave him some time to think, but James already knew that his vacation had been ruined. The fun and excitement he had hoped for were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of his actions. There was no going back now. James sat in the police station, his phone buzzing on the table in front of him. He knew it wasn't good news. Every time the phone buzzed, his stomach twisted a little more. He had a sinking feeling that this was only the beginning of the mess he had made. His friends, who had been with him earlier that day, were already gone. They had made it clear they didn't want to be involved in the drama. They'd texted him, but their messages were short and distant. "Hope you get this figured out," one of them had written. James hadn't responded. He didn't know what to say. He had messed up, and now he had to face the consequences alone. It wasn't long before the news outlets picked up the story. The incident at Buckingham Palace, involving the tourist who had thrown a rock at the royal guard's horse, was too big to ignore. James wasn't just a tourist anymore. He had become a part of the news, a part of a scandal. The social media storm began almost immediately. His video, the one showing him mocking the guards and then throwing the rock, spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions of people had seen it. People from all around the world were commenting, some angry, some amused, and others just in disbelief. But no matter what, they all had one thing in common. They were talking about him. James' phone kept buzzing with notifications. He had tried to turn it off, but the messages kept coming. He opened one, then another. The comments were brutal. "What a fool! Why would anyone mess with the royal guard? He's lucky the guard didn't take action. What an embarrassment! Can't believe this guy is representing tourists. He'll be known as the idiot who tried to mess with the Queen's guard." The messages went on, and James felt a weight on his chest. People were calling him names, some even saying he should be banned from returning to the UK. His own social media accounts were flooded with posts. The video was everywhere, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It was even shared by news organizations. He had become a joke to the entire world. In the next few hours, the situation got worse. Celebrity news outlets began reporting on the incident. They shared the video, discussed his actions, and even made jokes about it. James was mocked and turned into a laughingstock. Some people, though, didn't see the humor. They were disgusted by what he had done, and they didn't hold back. James stared at his phone, feeling his face go red with embarrassment. He had no idea that a simple prank could explode into something so big. What he had thought would be a funny moment had turned into a global story, and not in a good way. His friends had already begun distancing themselves. They didn't want to be associated with him anymore, and some of them even started making jokes at his expense. James couldn't blame them. After all, they had warned him to be careful, but he hadn't listened. The media storm showed no signs of slowing down. James didn't know what to do. He was stuck in a situation he couldn't control. And worse, he could already see the long-term effects of his actions. His reputation was in tatters, and he would never be able to shake off the nickname he had earned, the tourist who disrespected the Queen's Guard. The next day, James was still sitting in the same police station, trying to process everything that had happened. His head was spinning. What had started as a fun trip to London had turned into a nightmare. He had no idea how he was going to fix things, or if he even could. He just knew that his actions had led him into a deep mess, and now he had to face it. The officers had finished taking his statement, and they had given him some paperwork to sign. It was clear that he would have to pay a fine for his actions, and he was also told that he would be banned from Buckingham Palace for life. The news hit him hard. He couldn't believe how quickly his careless joke had led to such severe consequences. As the officers wrapped up their paperwork, James felt a wave of regret wash over him. He hadn't thought about how his actions would affect others, especially the royal guard and the people who worked so hard to keep the ceremony running smoothly. He hadn't realized how important those moments were to the people of London, and now he had ruined it for everyone. The guard on the horse, the people who came to see the palace, and even his own reputation. He had harmed them all with a thoughtless decision. James sat alone in the room, looking at the door. He had no idea how long he would be in London. His flight home was booked for a few days later, but it didn't feel like he could leave just yet. The guilt of what he had done still hung heavy on him. He had hurt more than just his own chances for a good vacation. He had hurt the reputation of tourists who came to the city looking to experience its culture and beauty. As he scrolled through his phone, reading the endless messages and comments about the incident, James realized that he couldn't hide from what he had done. The video of him throwing the rock was still being shared everywhere. He couldn't escape it. The world was watching him, and all he could do now was own up to his mistake. That evening, he sat down and decided to post a real apology online. It wasn't the kind of apology he had posted earlier, when he had tried to make excuses. This time, he was sincere. He admitted that he had been wrong, that he had disrespected the royal guard, and everyone who respected their traditions. He didn't try to explain it away. He simply apologized for his actions. The apology didn't fix everything, of course. The damage had already been done, but it felt good to finally take responsibility. He didn't expect people to forgive him right away, but he hoped that by admitting his mistake, he could at least show some accountability. The next few days were difficult. His social media accounts were still flooded with comments, many of them negative. But over time, the noise began to die down. Slowly, people moved on to the next viral story. And as for James, he had learned the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes, the consequences of a careless mistake last longer than you think. He knew he would never forget that day at Buckingham Palace, and he would never take for granted the importance of respecting other cultures and traditions. James had learned his lesson the hard way. It had been a few weeks since James had left London. The memory of the incident at Buckingham Palace still felt fresh in his mind. Even though the news and social media buzz around his mistake had started to fade, James knew that his life would never be the same. The consequences of his actions were still hanging over him, and it was something he would carry with him forever. Back at home, James had to face the aftermath. His friends were still upset with him. They couldn't believe he had messed things up so badly, and even though they had forgiven him, things weren't the same. They still made jokes about it from time to time, but James could tell they didn't look at him the same way anymore. James had spent hours reflecting on that day, the moment he had thrown the rock and disrupted the royal guard. It seemed like such a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but the fallout had been far greater than he ever could have imagined. The fine, the ban from Buckingham Palace, and the public backlash were just the beginning. The real lesson was deeper than that. He had realized, too late, how important respect was. Respect for the people, the traditions, and the culture of the places you visit. James had disrespected not just the royal guard, but all of the people who came to see the ceremony. The tourists who had been there that day, the guards who stood in their place, and even the British people who valued their traditions, all of them had been affected by his thoughtless prank. While he had tried to apologize online, and while he had learned his lesson, James knew the damage would never fully go away. The story had become part of his legacy. The video of the rock-throwing incident was still out there, floating around the internet, a reminder of what he had done. It wasn't just a funny mistake. It was a serious error that had led to real consequences. And for that, James would always be remembered, even if only as a cautionary tale. But despite everything, James didn't feel defeated. He had made a foolish mistake, but he also had the chance to learn from it. As much as he regretted his actions, he knew that he could grow from the experience. He had learned the hard way about the importance of respect, not just for the royal guard, but for people in general. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about recognizing when you've made a mistake and working to be better. As time went on, the internet moved on to the next big story, and the world forgot about James. But for him, the lesson stuck. He had learned to think before acting and to always consider the consequences of his actions. That day at Buckingham Palace had taught him more than any other lesson he could have learned on his trip. And while he would never be able to undo what he had done, James had made a promise to himself. He would never again make the same mistake. The legacy of that foolish mistake would remain, but so would the lessons he had learned from it.